everybody, to the 5th online talk in the series Philosophical and Psychological Approaches to Virtue and Values, which is part of our interdisciplinary project entitled Using Values to Increase Intellectual Humility Among Political Partisans, which is run out of the University of Bath and Cardiff University, both based in the UK. The PI at the University of Bath is Professor Greg Mayo, who is a professor of social psychology, and the PI at Cardiff University is myself, and I teach philosophy there. The project is sponsored by the Georgia State University as part of their project Applied Research on Intellectual Humility, which is ultimately funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And we are very grateful to our sponsors for enabling us to conduct this research. Today's speaker is Professor Blaine Fowers, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Miami. Professor Fowers is the author of many books on virtue, human society, on flourishing, and his most recent co-authored book with Christian Christensen is Phronesis, Retrieving Practical Wisdom in Psychology, that was published by Oxford University Press in 2024. The title of today's talk is Assessing Wisdom and the Place of Intellectual Humility. Thank you, Professor Fowers, for accepting our invitation. We are very pleased to have you here, and we look forward to listen to your talk. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that very nice introduction. And it's nice to have some orientation to the project that you're working on. As Professor, is it Tanasini?
It is.
That's correct. Okay. Said we published a book on phronesis last year, and that will be a big part of the talk today, although it isn't the whole thing, because I thought it would be worthwhile to tie it into the intellectual humility that many of you are interested in. And I want to also thank you for being flexible about my talk. We had scheduled it earlier, and I was unable to be there. I double scheduled myself without thinking about it. Sometimes it's hard to correlate my work schedule with my personal schedule, and that was one of the times I made a mistake with it. So I appreciate your being here, and I think I have a talk that I think will be interesting to you. Now, the thing I should say is that you'll be able to tell probably, and maybe you already know, that I was trained as a psychologist. But the truth is I've done interdisciplinary work for several decades now. And it turns out that I spend as much time with philosophers as I do with psychologists. And so I'm used to there being two different languages, two different disciplines, two different ways of thinking about things. And I try usually to speak in a way that people from multiple disciplinary backgrounds can understand what I have to say. So try to avoid jargon. But if I end up saying things that are difficult to discern or difficult to work out, let me know, and I'll be happy to clarify it. So as you probably know, many of you know, phronesis is a Greek word that is usually translated as practical wisdom, and it's a centerpiece of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and his views on virtues. Intellectual humility is an interesting virtue, one that has, we were talking before about how it's really exploded in the last couple of decades, that the interest from positive psychology, the funding from the Templeton Foundation, and lots of people who are interested, whether they're positive psychologists or not, has made it a very vibrant field. What has happened a lot, it's been interesting to me, is that phronesis and intellectual humility have been conflated a lot. And there are lots of people who think that humility is an inherent part of virtue. And so what I want to do is talk about that relationship a little bit more today, and try to sort it out a little bit. So, whoops, let's see. Get my computer functioning. There we go. So here's the agenda I have. So a little bit of a roadmap for you. I'm going to begin with a history of phronesis research because that's a pretty interesting area that you may or may not know a lot about. Then I'm going to provide a few definitions of intellectual humility and contrast that a little bit with the Aristotelian Phronesis Model, which is the model that Christian and I developed in our book. And then I'm going to differentiate traits and processes. And what I'm going to end up concluding is that humility is more of a trait or a virtue, and phronesis is more of a function. And I'll tell you more about what I mean by that as we go through. But that's the basic plan of today's talk. And we'll see if hopefully it'll all make sense to you as I go through it. So in the beginning, it's helpful to know that there is actually a long history of wisdom research. And I say here phronesis, maybe I should have said wisdom, because there's some debate about whether many of the researchers have even studied phronesis. They may have been studying something quite different, like Sophia, let's say. So some kind of generic or general or spiritual wisdom even. And there are some traditions that are really focused very much on a more spiritual take on things. But I'll talk through that a little bit so you have a sense of how the phronesis literature or the wisdom literature has unfolded in psychology. And so it began really with the Berlin wisdom model. And well, they call it a paradigm. So this was conducted at the in Berlin, and these researchers talked about wisdom from a particular perspective, and they really kicked off the whole thing. So they were the beginning in the 1990s in the psychology sphere, at least, where they were trying to get an empirical understanding of wisdom. So, of course, there's been a long history of philosophers discussing wisdom in various ways, and that's very valuable as well. But the psychologists got started in the 1990s, so we're kind of late to the game, but interested in reporting some data. So the Berlin wisdom paradigm was the beginning. Then there's the self-report phase, where I'll talk about during the 2000s and 2010s, there were a number of self-report measures created to try to study wisdom. And then I think there was an Aristotelian phase, which is where I would put us now, that there are two sets of researchers who are trying to have a more Aristotelian take on wisdom, which would make it more like phronesis. And so in psychology, as probably many of you know, empirical research usually means we want to create quantitative measures. So all of these things, the Berlin wisdom paradigm, self-report phase, the Aristotelian phase, all of them have been conducted from an empirical point of view. And that means that we're looking for quantitative measures. So the other thing about psychology is that theory inclusion is actually pretty rare. Most psychologists don't talk very much about theory. Now, the people in Berlin were quite different in that way, and that's, I think, a difference between American and European psychology is you see more theory in Europe than you do in the United States. But often I'll look at it and it's like a wasteland for me, there just isn't very much theory. And so people create a measure and they think they have something that is viable and valuable, and it is in a certain respect, but they often don't really think very deeply about what it is they're doing. So I think what happens a lot of times is the theory gets neglected in favor of a quantitative approach. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then the history of this research, it could look pretty chaotic from certain respects. But from my view, I think there are three phases, and I think it has a fairly logical progression. You may differ, some of you may differ in your way of seeing it, but this is the way I'm going to talk about it today. And so I think that there are some important trends, and that understanding them helps us to get a grip on this literature of this wisdom literature, and it helps us to move forward in terms of how it relates to intellectual humility. So I'm going to give you a chart next, a little table. It's kind of a little bit complicated, but it's really actually pretty simple. And I've tried to divide it up in a way so that you can understand what I'm doing. And it's these three phases. So there's the beginning phase with the Berlin wisdom paradigm. There's a phase of self-report measures. And then I think there's a more recent Aristotelian phase that we'll talk about. So here's the table. And what these names here are all abbreviated. So BWP stands for Berlin Wisdom Paradigm. And then around that time, also Robert Sternberg started talking about wisdom as well. And he came up with a balance theory that has a certain amount of currency, but I don't believe he ever created a measure. So he's an unusual psychologist in that he talked more about theory than empirical data. But what you'll see is that in the beginning, this first phase, the concepts were fairly abstract. Whoops, that wasn't what I meant to do. Let me go backwards. And so they were fairly abstract. Now, Sternberg had a little bit more concreteness to his, so he was interested in that. And in fact, the BWP had its own concreteness because it was, in fact, a measure. So what they did is they had people respond to vignettes, and then they actually coded the vignettes. So I was speaking with Dr. Tennessini before about how expensive and difficult that is. That's exactly what they found. It was very expensive and very difficult. So one of the things that happened with the Berlin Wisdom Model or paradigm is that it wasn't really taken up and used. It was just too expensive and too difficult. And so they created a measure. It's really very admirable in a lot of ways. It's very specific and elaborate, but it was just too difficult for people to do. And what they did, though, is they looked at wisdom as a trait, and so did Sternberg. And the BWP includes humility to some degree. So they have something they even say that they're interested in people being able to deal with uncertainty. And that's a big part of wisdom for them. So that uncertainty translates for a lot of people now into something very much like intellectual humility. That, you have the view that people may know something you don't know, and that it's possible to see things differently, and that we should be open to these differences and be able to do it, and that would be a wise thing. So that showed up very strongly or pretty strongly, but it wasn't called humility in the BWP. But I think today you look at their definition, it very much comes out as humility. Then, because this BWP was so difficult and so time consuming, people came up with other measures. And again, one of the time-honored ways for psychologists to create measures is through self-report. And so all of these measures that were created in the 2000s through 2010 are self-report measures. So basically, psychologists ask people how wise they are. Well, that would give a lot of people pause, and it did, and it does, that people can get that wrong. That I might think I'm quite wise, and I might answer the questions suggesting that I have a lot of wisdom, but I could be wrong about that. So even the very idea of intellectual humility makes us wonder, is it possible to really self-report about wisdom? The other thing is that self-report scores are they're suspect in a lot of ways. One is that it might be socially desirable to think of myself as wise. I might just be confused or wrong about how much wisdom I have, and so I couldn't give you an accurate report. There's a lot of problems with self-report. But these measures were created in good faith by very smart people, and they were very concrete. So they're really clear about what they mean by wisdom, and they all include various parts. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at these different measures, this stands for the adult self transcendence inventory. This one I'm sorry, that's what this one is. ASTI is the adult self transcendence inventory. This is the self-assessed wisdom scale, the SAWS. 3DWS is the three-dimensional wisdom scale. Then there's the wise thinking and acting questionnaire, and finally the wisdom development scale. So as you can tell by just the names of these scales, they measure something quite differently. And so there are, I've listed 5 here. There are more self-report scales than that, but those are the 5 that I think are most helpful to know about. And it turns out that all of these measure something rather different, and it's rather different from the way they think about it to the way they create items, and even down to the measurement. So when we have looked at these scales in combination, they seldom correlate more than 0.3. And that's in psychology is kind of a standard level of correlation among things. But what it means, if you understand a correlation of 0.3, is that you're only capturing around 9% of the variance in common. So these scales are different in very large ways. They're not really the same thing at all. So that's one of the problems we have is there's kind of a fragmentation that happens. People create a scale and they create different scales and they have different ideas that they start from, and they're really not measuring the same thing at all. And so what you see on this side of the thing, one of the things that they have in common is that all of them are thinking of wisdom as a trait. And some of them have humility as a part of that trait. So they explicitly include humility. Now, Monica Ardelt, for example, you may know her. I've met her a couple of times. Very nice, very smart person. She has what she calls the 3-dimensional wisdom scale, and she includes certain kinds of affect in it. In the ASTI, Levinson et al. Include self-transcendence as a big part of wisdom. So they're all coming at this a little bit differently. But I thought what was interesting is that a couple of these scales actually include humility in the scales. They have items that measure something about wisdom, and they think humility is part of that wisdom. So I think that's something worth noting. And the third phase, and I've blocked these off with these nice thick lines, is what I would call the Aristotelian phase. So Igor Grossman and Brienza and others came up with what they call the situated wise reasoning scale. And when Christian and I looked at this scale, we could see a very strong Aristotelian provenance to it. So it was much more interesting to us than some of these earlier measures, which could be classed as measuring some kind of broader wisdom concept like Sophia, or even something as narrow as Dinotes, which could be said to be cleverness rather than wisdom. And so from an Aristotelian perspective, he differentiated those 3 in a way that is very helpful in saying that cleverness is sort of an overarching category, and wisdom is one form of it when we're actually pursuing what's good. And so that's one of the things you'll see with Aristotle is that he's very clear that this is about the good life, and it's that wisdom is for the sake of living well. And so it's not amoral, it's not cleverness, which could be, we could seek either moral or immoral aims, but it's rather something that we're pursuing for the sake of the good life. So we think that the Swiss tries to assess that. They're interested in wisdom in terms of it being a kind of metacognitive skill, but one that's related to goodness. However, in our view, they also discuss wisdom as a trait. But the way they measured it's interesting. So they didn't just use self-report in a straightaway kind of how wise are you, or do you do these things, or what's your common, your most likely response in general. That's what you get with self-report is a sort of a general take on things. So when you do a self-report measure, you ask people to kind of summarize their whole lives with a number. With each item gets a number. So you ask them, how often do you listen to other people's views, even if you disagree with them? So that might be an intellectual humility item. And you would say, quite often, say a 4. And so you put down a 4, and then those get summed up, and you have a wisdom score. Well, what Brienza et al. Did with the situated wise reasoning scales, they gave people vignettes, and they actually asked them, in a recent decision that you made, how much did it involve wisdom? So they had a number of items to assess that. So they were looking at specific instances as opposed to having people summarize a general trait. So that what they did is they tried to get away from this self-report tendency to some degree. Now their measure is still self-report in that the person is telling you how well they did on something, but it's about a particular decision, not something in general. So we saw that as an advance, but like the other self-report scales, they were really talking about this as a trait. And Brienza et al. Also include humility in their scale. So they seem to think that it's a big part of it. They don't include emotions. So Monica Ardelt and others have given them a hard time about that. And Levinson and his colleagues also said, where's the self-transcendence in this scale? We don't see it. So this is the kind of disagreements you get, is that people have certain things that they champion, and then they are really looking for that in other people's measures. Well, you don't see that in the Swiss, but we did like their vignette approach, and we thought they did a good job. They also gathered a group of people to talk about wisdom, and this is something that Igor in particular championed, and tried to come up with what he called a common model of wisdom. And they did quite well with this, and it was something they found a fair amount of consensus about. But then there were about 8 or so dissensus articles. So people wrote, well, but you didn't do this, and this wasn't included in the common model the way we wanted to. So Monica talked about emotions, and Levinson et al. Talked about self-transcendence, and other people talked about other things. So we still don't have any kind of agreement about this in psychology. There's a lot of difference of opinion. And so what we decided to do, Christian and I, and along with Catherine Darnell and some others, is we created what we call the Aristotelian Phronesis Model. So we went back to Aristotle and we said, well, what did he say? He's the one that people have been following to some degree for a long, long time. So what did he actually say? So I'll share that with you, what we came up with. But we think that this is a very concrete thing. We follow Aristotle in that he talked about particulars with great frequency. He talked about, he did talk in the abstract, he wrote in the abstract, but he also wrote that it always comes down to particulars. You can't have wisdom unless you're making particular wise decisions and following those decisions with actions that have wisdom in them. One of the things that we did is we harked back in some ways to the Berlin wisdom paradigm, in that we thought that it was important to include performance measures as well as self-report. So we have both self-report and performance measures. Now, performance measure is where you have people actually do something, make a claim, and you check to see how well it fits with some kind of model. And that might be experts, that might be expert raters. But anyway, you have a check, and so they can get it right or wrong. We think that's an important part of wisdom, that it's possible to be more wise or less wise. And the standard we use is usually an expert standard. Now, of course, different experts could disagree, and you could not like our experts' views at all, but at least it's a standard, and it's possible to be more or less wise according to us. And not just in what people say about themselves, but in what they actually do. And so that's the value of a performance measure. And we don't see wisdom as a trait at all. And that's what you see with this X over here, is I'm saying that we see it more as a process, as something people do, they go through, they have a way of formulating things, and that process might be better or worse. And so I'm going to tell you what that process looks like, at least what we think it looks like, what we gleaned from Aristotle. Now, if you've read Aristotle, you know that he is sometimes infuriating, that he will say things in ways that leave a lot of important details out. And he'll sometimes say things in perfectionistic ways. So there are two things that we've done with Aristotle. We consider ourselves neo-Aristotelians because we give him the first word, but we never give him the last word. So we think that he has a lot to offer and a lot to say, but that sometimes we need to flesh out what he says. Sometimes we need to correct what he says. And there's some famous examples of that, like his views on women and slaves. We think he was just wrong about that, and he was very much a creature of his times. So we don't think that he was right. So we see no reason to make the differentiations he does. And when you read his work on this, it seems like it sticks out like a sore thumb, both in terms of what he did say and in terms of how little it matters to the rest of his philosophy, if you look at it. At least that's the way I look at it. So we think there are these three phases. And what happens then is there are some noteworthy features of this history. First, as I said, we have the Berlin wisdom paradigm, which is rather abstract. They talk about wisdom as being expertise in the art of living. So that's a fairly abstract view, but they also had it, they measured it in very concrete ways. They had people rate other people's discussions of how they would make a decision. So that made that paradigm very difficult to apply. And not very many people tried to do it outside of the people who developed the paradigm itself. But what I really like about what they did is that they were very performance focused. They weren't just asking people, how wise are you? They were suggesting that it's possible to have more or less wisdom. So I think that's a really valuable thing. And that's something they did quite well. And anyway, I see their work as very admirable in terms of they did some difficult things and they didn't shy away from problems that were difficult to solve. However, it's just too difficult. I mean, people can't do it. We don't have the funding, we don't have the time, we don't have that kind of thing. So we ended up with a lot of people developing self-report measures, as I said, and they tend to be fairly concrete. And they tend to have specific things involved with wisdom. So they say wisdom is X, Y, and Z. And everybody has a different X, a different Y, and a different Z. And there's some overlap, but it's really not very much overlap. Now, those tend to be focused on traits that people have. So someone is considered a wise person as a trait, pretty much. And they assess them in a global way. And I think that's an important thing to notice about self-report is that these measures ask people to summarize their entire lives in a set of items. And that somehow that sum is going to give you a measure of where they fall on the spectrum of wisdom. So you can see that I have a little bit of, I take that with a grain of salt, certainly, and that self-report is valuable. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's the wrong thing to do. I think it's something that it's a good place to start in any case, because it's not that difficult. It's relatively easy, it's relatively inexpensive, and it can give us a lot of insight. And people do know things about themselves. So I don't think self-report is always wrong. But what happens is the self-report measures always get made by people who have certain views, and their views show up in the kind of items they pick. And in some cases, as I said, they included intellectual humility in it. So they thought that was an important part of wisdom. Being willing to admit that you're wrong would be a good thing, they thought, something that would help to indicate someone's wisdom. So they included that. Then along came a few people who thought Aristotle might have something to teach us, including Brienza and Grossman and Christiansen and myself and Darnell and some other people. So we went back to try to see what he had to say. And we see phronesis more as a process as opposed to a trait. And in particular, Aristotle portrays phronesis or wisdom as a meta virtue. And I think that's a really important distinction that a lot of people miss, is that it really operates at a different level than other virtues, and it guides us in our virtue application. And then we also re-included performance measures. So we thought that was a good idea, and it shouldn't all be based on self-report. So we looked at different things. And so one of the things we looked at was moral emotions. And if you want to get information about emotions, a person is probably one of the best sources of information for that. So something about moral emotions is probably going to have at least a portion that would be self-report. On the other hand, if someone appreciates a situation and the morality of the situation, they could get the situation right or wrong. And so it's possible to have a performance measure of that where we look at to what degree do they agree with others experts in particular about whether a situation includes a moral element or not. So that's what we did. And let me tell you, I'll share with you now our, well, first I'll share with you some definitions of intellectual humility. You've probably seen some of these and used similar ones. There are many of them and there are others. I just picked three that kind of stood out to me. One is from Mark Leary, who's a favorite of mine. He was my social psychology professor when I was a student at Texas. And then he went to Duke and he was my daughter's social psychology professor. And then he retired. So Mark is a wonderful person. He thought that intellectual humility involves recognizing that one's beliefs and opinions might be incorrect, being open to learning from the perspectives of others. So that sounds very much like a disposition or trait, doesn't it? Sounds like something you do in a regular sort of way. We wouldn't say someone is intellectually humble unless they were that way in a pretty predictable, reliable way. And so that's what we think about. That's how I think about a trait, is something we do in a predictable, reliable way. Now, when I say trait, what's going to come to many people's mind is a distinction from situations that might also influence us. That was a big debate in psychology for a long time between traits and situations. Turns out most psychologists now think that was another kind of false dichotomy, that both traits and situations are always operative. So it's not that you have one or the other, one is first or more powerful than the other, it's that both are important. So when I say trait, I'm taking that as part of a given. Then Church and Samuelson have another definition. They say intellectual humility is a disposition, so they actually use the term, to be non-defensive and open to the possibility that one's beliefs could be mistaken, and to engage with others in ways that respect their intellectual autonomy. So that's even more of a disposition. And then finally, Hooke and his colleagues thought that intellectual humility is defined as having a proper view of one's intellectual strengths and limitations, being open to the idea that challenge one's beliefs, and respecting the intellectual abilities of others. So again, all these things have this reliability factor. It seems like something about the person, that they're actually a humble person, that could be ascribed to them as a trait or a common thing that they would do. I think that's an important part of humility. And a lot of people look at intellectual humility in that way, or just simply they call it humility. And so it's a trait that you can have more or less of. And I think that's a pretty good way to think about it. So now any of you who've studied Aristotle know that he never used the word humility. And for him, that was not exactly what was important. The word he used was pride. And what I can tell you, though, is that humility researchers and thinkers have come around to something very similar to his view. Even though it's called humility, you can look at what Aristotle said about pride, and if you just replace the words and a few other descriptors, it becomes very, very similar. It's having a proper appreciation of your talents and of your abilities, and that some people are more able or more talented than you, or may know things you don't know. And that's what he thought pride was, that you should have appropriate pride in what you do and what you're capable of, but not that other people don't have things you don't have. So proper pride means admitting that you sometimes don't know things or can't do things, and other people can do them or know them better. And the same thing comes with, I think, many definitions of intellectual humility now. So I was given the opportunity to review a book on humility, and I was very pleased to see that all the authors in this edited book looked at humility in that way. Because where I grew up, humility was a very different thing, and it wasn't such a great trait, I don't think. So I think the way that most humility thinkers look at it now is a very good way in terms of having a proper appreciation of your strengths and others. Okay, so now let me talk to you about the Aristotelian Phronesis model, and this will bring this contrast out much more clearly. So Christian and I, along with others, developed this model that includes 4 non-sequential functions or components. You can talk about it either way. I like the function language better because I'm a bit more interested in processes than I am in chunks of things. So I like the function language, but some people like the component language. I think it works either way. So we had four non-sequential functions. So these things are going on in a way that one influences the other, and they all occur at a similar point in time, and you might go back to one or the other as you go along. So, but you have to kind of talk about them in order. So I want to make sure you know that I don't mean that they have this order and that there's a set of stages that one follows the other. The first one is the constitutive function. And that might be also called the moral perception function. So it's being able to see that a situation calls upon us to exercise some moral discretion, that we might need a virtue in that situation. So it may be a situation of risk, so courage may be important. Maybe a situation that involves giving, so generosity becomes important. It may be a situation where knowledge is important, and so some degree of humility is important. So recognizing what's at stake in a situation is important, and having an understanding of what it would mean for me to comport myself morally in this situation is a good thing. So that helps us to constitute our understanding of the situation, which is where that term comes from. A second feature is that sometimes we have to do some kind of adjudication. So some situations call for more than one virtue. So what's most important? What should we prioritize? Is a situation so defined, or we perceive it or praise it in such a way that one virtue just simply trumps the other ones, and we just have to focus on one alone. So you might think about a physician in this case, where of course we expect physicians to give us honest appraisals of our situation, or give us a diagnosis, or help us understand what the difficulty is, and to do that honestly. But we also would like them to be kind. We don't want them just to blurt things out, and we'd like them to have a kind of a nice bedside manner so they can tell us things in a way that we can absorb them. So we might have a situation where both kindness and honesty is called for in this particular situation. Sometimes when I work with students, the same sort of thing. I could be brutally honest with them, but that wouldn't be that helpful, because they're looking for me to be kind. They want me to be more of a mentor than someone who just gives them bald feedback. So I think kindness and honesty often go together. Or we might have a situation where that calls for some kind of justice or fairness, but also maybe some degree of mercy as well. So with the adjudicative function, we need to harmonize virtues. So we might want someone to be honestly kind, or kindly honest. Or it may be, I'm sure you've been in these kind of situations where it doesn't really pay to sugarcoat things or to be nice about it, because some people don't appreciate subtlety, and we just need to be really clear with them. So maybe we're just going to go pretty much all the way with honesty, because otherwise we're not going to be able to get the point across and help people understand what they need to. So this adjudicative function is something we have to do in each situation, because the situation may call for more than one kind of virtue or strength, character strength. The third one is emotional regulation. Now that's a bit of an unfortunate term, because it suggests that cognition somehow controls emotion, which I don't think is the case. That's another one of those dichotomies in psychology that for a long time people debated about which was primary, which was first, which was most important. And now what we understand is there's always cognition and there's always emotion in everything we do. So what we want to do is be able to integrate them and have them be cohesive. And so our cognition and our emotion work together to bring us to a particular end. So that's the point of the emotional regulation, is that we're trying to make sure that they're consistent, not have one kind of thought and a different kind of emotion, or have an emotion that is very strong and very maybe we react with a very strong emotion, and we need to think that through a little bit. We need to reappraise the situation. Or maybe the emotion alerts us to something that we didn't notice cognitively. And so our emotion is very important in that case, because it might alert us to, let's say, a power dynamic that we aren't really thinking about, or that someone is feeling very hurt about something that we thought was not very much of an issue, but we notice how hurt they feel or how sad they feel. And so that emotion will call attention to a part of the circumstance that's very important. So we want to work in a way so that our emotions and our cognitions are harmonious and are working together toward the same end. And this is one definition of virtue, is that emotions and cognitions are in harmony, and they lead to behavior that is also consistent with those two things. Then the final thing that we thought was important for wisdom is a blueprint function. And this is a general sense of the good life. So blueprint makes it sound very specific and particular, almost like we have a clear theory that we're all philosophers. Well, we're not all philosophers. We're not all psychologists. And so we think that it's more of a general sense of what's good in life, and that ordinary people can have this general sense. They don't have to have a well worked out and articulate theory, but they have to have an idea about what it would mean to live a good life. So it might be something like having a good partnership with a lifelong partner might be something someone considers part of a good life. And so they do a lot of things that help to foster that partnership and help to encourage it. And we would see that as part of a blueprint. And they might also have, for me, for example, being a professor is a really important part of the good life. And so being able to have time to think and read and write is very important to me. Well, it's not important to everybody, but that is my sense of a good life, is having time to do those things and having the space to do those things. So that is a general sense of good life. So those are the four functions of the APM. And it's easy to see how humility is an important part of all of them, right? Because I may think I understand a situation well in the constitutive function, but I might find that someone else has a better appreciation of the situation than I do. And it's really helpful if I listen to them, because it might alter how I look at things. Or same thing with adjudication. I might think that this is a situation that calls for some degree of humility and some degree of honesty. And I think that honesty is most important. And someone else would say, no, I don't think that's the best way to think about it. I think you really need to bring more humility into this situation. And that they might be correct about that, that I might get my emotion regulation a little bit wrong. And so, and I could also be a little bit wrong about my blueprint, that I could think that something's important, and I could be wrong about that. I could tell you an interesting story about that. I mean, my wife is really good at helping me to understand things that I don't understand well. And so sometimes she's given me some guidance that helped change my blueprint. And so humility can be active in all of these situations. But what we would also say is that would be true for any virtue. So the justice is going to be an important part of them, or fairness. Courage is going to be important in all of these things. Honesty is going to be important in all of these things. So it's not as though phronesis is something quite separate from virtues. Aristotle saw them as coextensive. In fact, what he said was that phronesis, if you have phronesis, you have all the virtues. And if you have the virtues, you also have phronesis. You can't have one without the other, at least not in a mature sense. So what we see then is phronesis is a meta virtue. It's something that helps guide us in terms of how we act. And there are many different versions of virtue. For example, the one that shows up most often in positive psychology, that's based on their VIA scale, there is no meta virtue in that. There are only a set of character strengths that you could have, more or less. And they actually even say that you could get by, you could do well if you only had 3 or 4. So we don't see it that way. We think that even though people are imperfect and limited, that some people have more wisdom than others, and they're able to exercise the virtues across the board in a better way than other people are. So this meta virtue of phronesis helps us to be able to enact other kinds of virtues. It gives us guidance about those things. Now, having said this about virtue in the 4-function model of phronesis, I have to also mention that there's a recent article by Shane McLaughlin, and Christian's a co-author of that, along with Steve Thoma. And what they did is they tried to create a new measure of phronesis that's shorter and more usable than the one we created. So there is a different view of phronesis out there from this, in some ways, from among the same group. So I just want to mention them. I'm not going to explain it to you because I think it's very detailed. And actually, they published a 40-page article. It's 40 pages in a journal, so it's really long and complicated. And they present a lot of data and so forth. So there's a lot to be said for it, but I'm just going to stick with the 4-function model because I think it's easier for our purposes. So what I've set up is this differentiation between traits and processes. So let me walk you through that, what I think that looks like. So I think humility is a virtue. And as I said before, what Aristotle talked about was pride, not really humility. But we like the word humility a lot more now than we like the word pride. And we often think of pride as something that's problematic. But I think that they both end up being very similar in the end if you have a good understanding of the two of them. But there's something that either pride or humility is more of a trait than anything else. It's something that we possess, something that we enact, something that we do reliably. And so it's a characteristic of the individual. Phronesis, on the other hand, I see as a meta virtue in that it is at a different level than virtues like humility. So it's a function or process that guides us in how to be humble. So the trick is, and I've seen this written a few times, and I think it's a great piece of insight, is that it's not a question of whether or not it's good to be humble. Of course it's good to be humble. The question is, what constitutes humility right now in this situation? What would it mean to be humble now? Or what would it mean to be courageous or generous or fair? These things are all difficult to work out, and that's exactly what practical wisdom helps us to do. It gives us guidance in what a virtue means at this moment in this situation. And it does so through appraising the situation appropriately, through being able to adjudicate various virtues, through being able to balance our emotions and cognitions, and by understanding what is it we're aiming for? What do we think a good life is? And how can we, in this situation, help to create that life? That's what phronesis does, in my view. And so there are many virtues, and I've given you a list of quite a few. I'm not a list guy, so I'm not going to be someone who's going to tell you there's a specific list of virtues. I think they vary, and that they can be described in different ways, and different people have different lists. And we see that throughout history. The list that the ancient Greeks had, if you read Homer, is very different than the list that you would find in a contemporary situation in the West. Also, those lists are going to be different based on culture. So I think that we need to have a certain amount of flexibility about that. But what we can say is there are many different virtues and that we often have to adjudicate among them. I think that if we mix traits and processes, it just confuses us. So we don't have a good theory if we do that. And so that's one reason that I want to keep phronesis and humility separate. And therefore, I don't think humility should be included in phronesis. I think it is an important virtue. It's valuable. It's a good thing to have. And it's better to be have appropriate humility than not. But that's not really a part of practical wisdom itself. Practical wisdom is something that helps us to manage how to be humble in particular situations, or how to be courageous, or how to mix courage and humility. Not so much that they're at the same level. So that's the thesis that I have, and I've now shared this with you. And so I think we can turn now to having some discussion. So I appreciate having the time today. And I've presented something to you, and now we can talk it over and see what we think about it. Oh, I've got to thank you. And there's my phone number and email. I'll just leave that up for a minute if you want to write them down. I'm certainly happy to speak with you, send you the slides, send you other reading materials, all kinds of things. So it's fun to be here with you, and I really appreciate your attention today. I think it's not a small thing that you have given me your attention throughout this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Blaine. I suggest it's 15:23 UTC, i.e. British time. So I suggest we take 3-minute break, and then we'll start with the Q&A at about 15:26. So if people just need to grab a drink or whatever, and then we'll start again in 3 minutes time. Henry, could you stop the recording, please?